All right. Good morning, everybody. Good evening to any of our India colleagues that might be joining us. We're excited today to have our monthly UISys talk, and today to have a representative from Texas A&M. So I'm going to do a quick introduction for Arun. Arun Kumar Karngala received his Bachelor's of Technology in Electrical Engineering from the National Institute of Technology, Warrengal in 2014. He is a doctoral candidate in electrical engineering department at Texas A&M in College Station. Before he was employed at the National Mineral Development Corporation in India's NISP power plant distribution department for 2 years. He is the director of the 5th annual Texas Power and Energy Conference in 2021 and received the Thomas W. Powell and Powell Industries Fellowship for the 2022 academic year. His primary research includes reliability analysis of power systems, grid edge, behind the meter, DER, blockchain for energy and blockchain. So we welcome to Arun, and there's a lot of different topics there. So today he's going to talk a little bit about behind the meter DER for reliability and looking at the risk for utilities. So Arun, take it away.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, the people across the continent, and good evening to the people back in India. So we're going to talk about effect of behind the meter DER on the reliability of distribution systems and the quantification of risk to the utility business. Right. So this presentation is going to be in two parts. The first part is going to be the effect of behind the meter DER on the reliability, and the second part is going to be the quantification of the risk. Now, give you some context of what is happening here. Let us look at the electricity demand by sector, right? So the electricity demand by sector in the USA, 38% of that is from residential loads, and of that 38%, 74% are specifically single family detached homes, right? And also please feel free to stop me whenever you guys have a question. I want it to be more interactive than like just going from one side. Yeah. So my focus is on capturing or analyzing these specific loads, residential loads, and looking at what happens if these loads are having more behind the meter DER and how that will affect the reliability, right? And to give you some context of how these people are trying to get DERs behind the meter, here's a survey that has been done by Pew Research Center in January 2022. In this research report, they have shown that about 62% of people in the Pacific region of the United States are willing to or have already have installed DERs. 17% of them are already have installed DERs, and 45% are thinking of installing DERs behind the meter. And if you look at the numbers here, most of the numbers are about 45%, average is about 45%, and most people want to install DERs in the Pacific and the mountain regions. And another snippet of New York Times article here from March 2022 shows that frustrated with utilities, some Californians are leaving the grid. People want to go to the grid because of blackouts, wildfires, and higher electricity prices. People just want to defect the grid and be standalone and supply their own energy needs. So keeping this in mind, the analysis that we have done here and that I'm going to present here is what happens if these residential loads have DERs behind the meter, and when they have DER behind the meter, what is the loss to the utility? Utilities will definitely face some shrinkage in their revenues. They will face some loss in their revenues, and how will that affect reliability? So to look forward, what we did here is we looked at what kind of losses the utilities will see and what are the effects of that, and then why do we need to actually quantify these losses? How do we quantify these losses, and how do we quantify the risk from these losses? So here is a residential unit model that we have used for this analysis. Here we have a rooftop solar, energy storage, and energy management system that controls the rooftop solar and energy storage. And then this model can, or this residential model can export to the grid the excess power and can import from the grid the power needed for its net demand. Right. And the net demand for this residential unit model is given by this equation. The net demand is the load demand that is within the residential unit subtracted by the energy generated by the rooftop solar and whatever energy is stored, whether it is recharged or discharged to meet the loads. So the net demand is the demand that is actually seen by the utility. Right. Now, whenever the net demand is positive, the residential unit has deficit of energy and it is importing the energy from the grid. Whenever the net demand is negative, it has excess energy. Now, in some places, in some utilities, they have net metering scheme where you can export your excess energy and you can get paid for that. But if you don't have that, you might as well just export, or you can dump that energy on site, or you can just curtail your energy generation. So there are different ways of doing this. And now it is very important to note that net metering is a very important factor while considering the losses to the utilities. Now, this is the residential unit model. Now, we know that grid adoption, the DER adoption happens in two ways. As in the previous slide, it can happen in a grid supplemented way, where we have people installing behind the meter DERs, but also still being connected to the grid. And the second one is grid defection, where the behind the meter DRs are installed and the residential unit is completely standalone. They are not connected to the grid in any whatsoever manner. So we're going to look at these two modes of adoption and the losses in revenue in each specific modes of adoption, and what are the possibilities of grid supplemented adoption, grid defection, and where grid defection is a possibility. This is the first part of the presentation. Now, when we look at the grid supplemented adoption, the primary objective of people having behind the meter DRs is economic incentive. That is the primary motive to pay less electricity bill. And the second one is reliability improvement. Obviously, you want to have better reliability than what the grid provides, so you have solar and energy storage behind the meter. Now, when these behind the meter resources are within the residential units, utilities will see reduced revenues. Okay. Utilities will see reduced revenues, and there are two schemes for it. When utilities have net metering option, they are going to see more pronounced losses. And when they are not having net metering schemes, they will see less losses in revenue. And here in the grid supplemented adoption, this is the way how we are calculating the loss. In this formula, you can see we are looking at whether the net demand is positive or negative. If the net demand is positive, then we are looking at what is the load that is lost, and then we are multiplying with the retail electricity price. If the net demand is negative, we are looking at what is the load that is lost, and also what is the excess energy that is actually being exported to the grid, and we are multiplying with the net metering price. In most of the utilities, the net metering price is very different from the retail electricity price. So most of the utilities offer about 25% of what the customer actually pays. So it depends on utility to utility and case to case basis. This is the loss for a residential unit in grid supplemented adoption. When we look at this graph here, we looked at LA County. It is the most populous county in the United States, and we looked at LA County and we did a study. We studied the projected loss in revenues for an average home in LA County with with change in DER size. Now we took the retail price from EIA, which is about $0.22 per kilowatt hour, and the net metering price is half of it. We have assumed it to be half. We don't know the price of it. So this is a more optimistic estimate of what is happening. But usually net metering price is about 1/3 or 1/4 of what people actually offer, the utilities actually offer. So when we look at these two graphs, we are looking at the losses with net metering and without net metering. Now, without net metering, the losses are not as pronounced as with net metering. And we can also see that as the size of the DER increases, along the x-axis, we have the size of PV, and along the y-axis, we have the size of energy storage. When these increase, losses increase. So it means to say that as the DER adoption size increases, losses increase. And with net metering, the losses are more pronounced. So the utility is losing about $3,000 with the highest size of DER, where the uh, price of actually having no DER is about $6,500. They are earning $6,500 per customer, but they are losing more than half of it in this case. This is a very specific county that we have used. Now, we also did another study. We extended the study to look at zone wise, and we looked at 100 most populous counties in the US, and we have uh, looked at where they are located. And to categorize the locations, we have used climate zones. So, to give an idea of how the US is divided into different climate zones, we have here the graph which shows there are 7 climate categories and 5 zones. The zones are hot and dry, hot and humid, mixed humid, and to the north we have cold and very cold, and the marine on the Pacific coast. The study that we did here is we are looking at the projected percentage change in revenue as the DER size increases. Now, what we did here is we assumed that in this study we kept the size of the energy storage 2 times the peak load of the unit. We have kept it as a constant, and we have changed the size of the PV. Now, in hot and humid zone, where there are 19 counties in the study, we looked at the losses with net metering and without net metering. Now, without net metering, the percentage losses are about 60% in hot and humid zone. So, any residential units that are located in the hot and humid zone, as the DER size increases, the maximum losses that the utility can see is in the vicinity of 60%. But with net metering, it is about 80%. And similarly to hot and humid zone, mixed humid zone fares the same way. The losses are about 60% without net metering, and with net metering, it's about 80%. These are moderate or not. I mean, net metering doesn't have that big of an effect, and the utility losses are only about 50 to 60% when the size of the DER increases, when they have the maximum possible DER size. But if you go to hot, dry, and marine zones, the losses are more pronounced. Here, if you look at the losses without net metering, the losses are about 65% in hot, dry zone. And without net metering, in marine zone, it's about 45%. But with net metering, if the utilities are actually losing more money than they earn. So the losses are about 120% with the highest amount of DERs available. And even if like moderate 4.5 kilowatt or 6 kilowatt PV, the losses are 80%. So utility is only making 20% of what they could have made by supplying power to these kind of residential units. Same way to marine zone. Marine zone also has like 9 counties and about 120% with the highest adoption of DER and about 80% with a moderate 6 kilowatt PV or 65% with 4.5 kilowatt PV. So these two zones have the highest effect of net metering. Net metering is actually detrimental for utilities in these zones. Coming back to the cold zone, we have cold zone, which is the north of the US, and there are 27 counties in the study that we have done. Here, the projected losses without net metering are taper off around 50%, and with net metering, they taper off around 80%. So with this study, we can say that hot, dry, and marine zones have the greatest variation in change in revenue. So net metering is detrimental in these zones with DER adoption. So it is actually bad for the utilities to have these kind of incentives to provide to the customers in these zones, especially to the southwest of the US and in the Rocky Mountains area. And then we have hot and humid and mixed zones where there's not much of a effect if there is net metering or if there is no net metering. And in the cold zone, there's a moderate effect, not pronounced, not less, but not pronounced as well. It's like a moderate effect. So we also this is the study for grid supplemented adoption, where the residential units are still connected to the grid. Now, the second type of adoption is grid defection, where utilities the residential units are completely going standalone and they're getting disconnected from the utilities. In this, the utilities will lose all of the money that they could have made if the unit was connected. And the primary objective of the customers doing this is better reliability than the grid and economical than the grid. If it is economical than the grid, they would definitely do it. And the primary objective is reliability. Now, here the study that we did is grid defection practical uh, possibility in the US, or is grid defection practically feasible with the limitations of rooftop PV size, with the limitations of energy storage? Is actually grid defection possible? So to do that, what we have done is we have developed a reliability constrained DER sizing model, which sizes the PV and energy storage by taking reliability as a constraint. This we modeled it as a mixed integer linear program, and here is the reliability constraint that we have introduced into this. Now we have used this model to study 100 different zones in the 100 different counties in the US, and this is something that we have come up with. Here we have 5 different zones. These are the 100 counties of the US that we have studied. And this is the PV capacity of optimal sized PV capacity. And this is the optimal sized energy storage capacity. Now, obviously, we can't have 60 kilowatt of rooftop PV or like 70 kilowatt hour of energy storage capacity. There are some practical limitations of uh, how much we can install behind the meter, how much we can have in the garage, the energy storage. So the practical limitations that we have considered here is, for an average size of the rooftop in the US, the maximum that they can install is about 90 panels. But considering the rest of the factors, we have limited it to about 65 to 70 panels, and that is about 25 kilowatt with the size of the panel that we have used. And when we constrain the uh, plot by the practical limits, we get this area where it is actually feasible for the customers to defect the grid. Now, is it economical or not? It depends, but these are the locations where it is actually feasible to get out of the grid. Out of 15 counties in the hot and dry location, 13 counties it is practically feasible. In hot and humid zones, 8 counties it is practically feasible. In cold zones, about 2 counties where there is more sunshine, it is practically feasible. And in the marine counties, one of the county it is practically feasible. So out of the 100 counties, about 24 counties, it is practically feasible for the people to defect the grid. With the limitations of PV size and ES size, it is possible to defect the grid. But is it economical? That is a question. It depends on where you're located, how much PV is available, and all that. So these are the two studies that we have done. Now, what is the impact of this, right? When you look at the map again with the zones, hot and dry locations, net metering is extremely detrimental for the utilities, and grid defection is actually a possibility in this zone. And it is very fairly obvious because this is the area where more sunlight is received in the US. Right? Now, for the marine zone, net metering is extremely detrimental. Grid defection, like there's only one unit that can defect the grid, like one county that can defect the grid. Cold and very cold net metering has a moderate effect, not big of an effect. Grid defection is not a problem here. Mixed humid net metering is not that big of a problem. There is no grid defection that can happen in mixed humid locations. Hot and humid, half of the counties in hot and humid can defect the grid. Net metering is not as big of a problem as considered in hot and dry locations. Now, why is it important to do this? Okay. So what happens is, because of the behind the meter DR penetration, the people consume less amount of energy from the grid. When people consume less amount of energy, they pay less, and that results in diminished utility revenue. When utility revenues are diminished, utilities will have less resources to maintain and operate the network. And that increases failures in the primary distribution network. And when the failures increase in the primary distribution network, it worsens the base reliability of the network. And when the reliability is a problem, as I've already mentioned in the first slide, that because of reliability concerns, people want to defect the grid. If it is a possibility, if it is possible, if it is practically feasible, people will defect the grid. And when grid defection happens, the number of customers to the actual network size decreases. So with the network that we have, the number of customers connected to the network decreases, and it becomes much more difficult with the reduced revenue to maintain that network, which again results in reduced reliability. Now, when the reliability reduces, it again motivates people to get into behind the meter DR adoption. So this becomes a vicious cycle unless and until something can be done, something needs to be done by the utilities to offer better reliability, or there needs to be a way that utilities can make money, still make money, where they can operate and maintain the network, but not going out of business and not affecting the base reliability of the network as much. For this reason, it is very important for us to quantify what is the risk that the utilities face with behind the meter adoption, and with this risk, what are the possible options that they can look for. So for that, quantification of risk is very important. Now we come to the second part, which is the risk quantification. And the reason for risk quantification is utilities need to know what is the risk because of that. The total reliability cost, looking at this slide, the total reliability cost for a system comes from utility and the consumer. This is for a traditional system. In a traditional system, to increase the system reliability, utility has to spend more on upgrades, more on different lines, more on redundant lines. So the utility cost increases. Now, what is happening in the newer grid architecture, as consumers are having more behind the meter DRs, utilities are losing money, and this extra money that they could have spent on reliability, it is lost. So the system reliability, the optimum value where the system is reliable, is moving towards left. So that is a huge problem for people who are still connected to the grid, but they don't have behind the meter DR. Right now, for this reason, it is important and it is paramount for us to quantify the risk. I've already shown you the loss with grid defection and loss without grid defection. So these are the two loss metrics that we calculated, and we also define a defection criteria. So the customer will defect the grid if they can have better reliability than the grid with the behind the meter DR that they have installed, and if they have if they don't have better reliability than the grid, they might as well still be connected to the grid by not defecting. The total loss that can be seen here is we have taken whether the customer is defecting the grid. If the customer is defecting the grid, the total loss is the loss here. If he is not defecting the grid, the total loss is given by this equation. Right. Now, when we look at this total loss equation, we can see that it is a function of the PV capacity, the energy storage capacity, and the load. Because net demand is a function of in the first slide I have shown you that net demand is a function of the energy storage capacity and the PV capacity. So we can say that loss is a function of PV capacity, energy storage capacity, and the load. Now we have the loss function. So how do we calculate the risk? Okay. So this is where we define risk. We define the risk as expected loss with DR adoption over revenue without DR adoption. We can say that risk is an expectation of loss over the revenue without DR. But when we want to calculate the expectation of loss, we need to know what could be the penetration of DR in the future. That is the first point. And the second point is what is the load at each residential unit? What is the load profile at each residential unit? And we also need to know what are the sizes of the DRs that might be that people might be adopting at different residential units. Now that is the in itself is a huge task to collect all of that data. So what we have done is that we have standardized the loss function. Basically, what we are saying here is we have standardized the residential unit model. The way we standardized it is we have divided or we have taken the min max of the PV capacity, ES capacity, and the load over the peak load or the peak connected load of the residential utility. So what happens here is this deload over D peak. Deload over D peak is nothing but it is the load profile, which has values from 0 and 1. If we assume that the load profile is same for all of the residential units in a distribution system or in a utility or in a same location, it is a fairly reasonable assumption given that most of the consumer behavior for single family detached homes is same. The load profile is fairly the same, so we can assume that this is a fairly reasonable case. So what happens is if this is a constant, then the loss function becomes the loss becomes a function of just the PV size and ES size, the normalized PV size and the normalized ES size. Now to calculate the expectation of the normalized loss, we can see that's a function of two random variables. Now we can show that the expectation of these two random variables can be given by this function, where g of xy is the loss function and fxy of xy, which is x is the PV norm and y is the ES norm. This is the joint probability distribution of PV norm and ES norm. We can redefine the risk as the expected loss, normalized loss, by the standardized revenue without DR. Okay, we know this is all of this math is a model, but what does the probability density actually mean, right? And do we have this data? How do we get this data? That is the bigger question here. Now, what does this joint probability density mean? It gives you the penetration or the forecasted penetration of DERs in the system in the form of a probability distribution. You can say that 2 years down the line, this is what the penetration might look like in terms of probability distribution, or 10 years down the line or 5 years down the line, this is what it might look like. Once we have that joint distribution, then we can estimate the loss and then we can estimate the risk. So the problem here is to actually know the joint distribution of this of the penetration in a specific location. But how do we get the joint distribution? Uh, right now we don't have the joint distributions. So what needs to be done is utilities have to step up and they have to conduct surveys by forecasting the distribution. They have to forecast the penetration levels in the future. From that, we can construct the joint distributions. So now we don't have the joint distribution. So how are we going to do this analysis? Like, is there a way to do this analysis without knowing the joint distributions? How are we going to go about finding the risk or quantifying the risk? So what we did here is we made some educated guesses about what could be the joint distribution or what could the joint distribution look like, right? Now, to describe a joint distribution, we need to know two things. The first is the marginal distribution of each variable, each random variable. The second is the dependence structure between these two random variables. Now, we can make this assumption, or it is fairly obvious that whenever people are trying to have PV behind the meter, they will also consider having energy storage behind the meter. It means that these two random variables are not independent. They're in fact dependent. Most likely when people are opting for PV, they will also opt for energy storage, right? So we have to understand what is the dependent structure and what kind of marginal distributions these variables might have. So here are some educated guesses, or here are some like probable marginal distributions that uh, these two variables might have. Right? So we are using a truncated normal distribution to describe these variables. Now we know the PV norm is nothing but the PV capacity behind the meter over the peak load of that unit, right? And it could be anywhere between 0 to some number 2 or 3. If the customer is having 2 times the peak load, it will be 2. 3 times the peak load, it's 3. 4 times, and we can go up to anywhere. But we have restricted it to be at a maximum value of 3, and the minimum value is clipped at 0. So the truncation happens here at 0, and the truncation happens somewhere at 3. Now we can see this this is the normal distribution, and the mean here, for these curves, the mean is at 0, and the variance, we have taken different variances. The first scale is at 0.25, the second is 0.5, and so on. Now what does the scale give you, right? As we increase the scale, we can see that in this distribution, most people are likely not to have any PV installed, right? and there are few people who will install 0.5 times the peak load of PV. But as the scale increases for zero point 0.5, let us say the scale at the variance at 0.5, you can see that there are more people installing PV and more people trying to install PV, and it is going up to 1 times the peak load. And as the scale increases further, more people installing, and as it is further increasing, more people installing. It means that it gives the penetration direction. So as more people are trying to get higher DR size, this variance is going to capture that. And these figures on the right gives you the cumulative distributions for the same probability density functions. Now we can say that, okay, we know the marginals. So as I've told you before, we need to know the marginal distributions of the random variables and the dependent structure, right? Now we have shown that, okay, these are probable good guesses for the marginal distributions, right? And it could be the same for the energy storage norm. Now, how do you define the dependent structure? These two are dependent, right? You can't have no PV and just have energy storage. It is a possibility, but very few people will have energy storage. And you can't have, like, say, 1 kilo or zero point 0.1 kilowatt of PV and have 10 kilowatt hour of energy storage. So there is some dependence that we need to understand between these two random variables. So how do we define the dependent structure? So to do that, we created a synthetic distribution system of 100,000 customers with 20% penetration level. So what do I mean by 20% is that 80,000 customers don't have any DER, and the rest of the 20,000 customers do have DER, right? But what is the size of the DER that they have? So we have taken some arbitrary sizes which are practically feasible. For an example, we can say that the customer might only have PV about one times the peak load. The customer might only have PV half times the peak load, or the customer will have PV and ES at 1 times the peak load. So we have taken some practically feasible DER sizes and created a synthetic distribution system, and we have sampled customer from the system. And we sampled the customers and we looked at the PV norm and ES norm, and then we calculated the covariance between these two random variables. So this covariance will give you the dependence structure between these two random variables. It is not a perfect thing that we can, it's not like a perfect covariance structure that could be defined in the wild, but it is a fairly good approximation, right? So we use this dependent structure, this covariance matrix, and then we sampled, or we have shown the joint distribution here for a variance of 0.25 between these two variables. So the dependent structure is shown here. This is the probability density function of the PV norm. On the left, you have the probability density function of the ES norm. This is how the variables are distributed. So you are most likely to have no PV and no ES. And if there is high PV, there is also high ES energy storage. And if there is moderate levels of PV, most likely we'll have moderate levels of energy storage as well, right? So we have defined this in this way. Uh, we could do a much better job if we had data from the utilities, but as the utility doesn't collect or do these kind of surveys, this is the most reasonable approximation that we can get to. So this is what we did with risk analysis. We have looked at LA County again, and we have looked at LA County and with different kinds of penetration. So with most of the people not having DR and only having about 0.05 or zero point 0.5 times the peak load, the DR of the half size of the DR, the risk is going to be 0.139. It's about 13%. There is a 13% risk, the utility, and with net metering, the risk slightly increases. You can see here the distribution of the PV norm. Most of the variables are around this area and about this area. The maximum that they reach about is about half of the peak load. So if you take this point, it means that there is about 0.3 times the peak load of solar and 0.3 times 0.6 times the peak load of energy storage. With this kind of a distribution, the risk is going to be 0.139, right? And as the penetration increases, the risk increases. And with net meter, it is much more pronounced. So the increase in penetration can be seen with this distribution. The PV norm was limited up to 0.6. Here it goes up to 1.5. And as we increase the scale, the PV norm and ES norm also increase. Now we can see that here in the previous slide, the risk was about 0.3 for an increased penetration. The risk goes to 0.34, and with net metering, it increases much further. And at risk at 1, at penetration at 1, the risk is about 0.4, and with net metering, it's about 0.5. So what does this analysis like specify? It tells that utilities are actually at risk in some locations, especially in LA County. You can see that the risk is about 0.5 with net metering, right? They are losing about 50% of their revenues. So at what level do these utilities need to make a change in their business practices? If it is business as usual, these utilities might not survive going further. And if your utilities will not survive, it is actually detrimental to the reliability of the distribution system, and is actually detrimental to the people who don't, or who will not have DRs behind the meter. So backward communities where no DR, like people with lesser economic incentives or lesser economic outlook, they will not be able to install DRs, and for them the reliability becomes an issue. So it is very important for the utilities to actually look at risk and say that, okay, this is the risk that I am at. How do I pivot from this particular business model to make enough money so that I can provide as good as reliability as before? So that is the primary objective of doing this risk analysis. But to conclude this, here are some basic points that you can take away from this seminar. First point is net metering is bad in some locations, especially in the hot and dry locations, and in hot and humid locations. No, hot and dry in the marine location, net metering is bad. Utilities are losing revenues. In some locations, it is good, especially in the colder climates, right? It is good to have net metering where it will encourage people to have behind the meter DR and align with, align with greener alternate sources of energy. And the utility can still be in business there. And DER adoption, we have to definitely address the point that DER adoption impacts utility business. It is a given thing. And by impacting utility business, it is also impacting system reliability. So there is no going back from this. Once DER adoption happens at a scale, system reliability is going to be at risk. And it is important for utilities to estimate risk, for them to pivot from the existing business models to cater to newer business models where they can still make money, retain the reliability of the grid, and offer more diversified services to the customers on need basis. And the thing that I want to ask or call out to the utilities is that utilities need to conduct surveys or forecast the penetration levels for the future. Now, to estimate risk, we need to forecast what could be the penetration levels. For that, you need to conduct more surveys, and with more surveys, we can get more data. With more data, we can get the joint distributions. With the joint distributions, we can estimate the risk. So that concludes the presentation, and thank you. If you have any questions, please.
Yeah, I guess I have a question. So how do you think, if you're a regulator, how do you deal with net metering when you're showing that some are good and some are bad, related to kind of the policy side of things, and what you discussed?
So, it is not like a one-stop solution for everything. Okay, that is one of the important things that we need to address here. It's not like a one-stop solution. We have to look at different locations with a different lens. Like, for example, as I told, hot and dry locations, if net metering is enforced there, it is going to be detrimental not just to the utility but to the reliability as well. So when policymakers are looking, or regulators are looking at net metering, they have to look at specific zones or specific utilities and then make a decision. It can't be just like, oh, nationwide we are going to have net metering enforced. That is not the right approach for this. From what we have studied, that might not be the right approach.
Okay. Are there no questions in the chat yet? So Well, there's a big question in the chat.
Oh no,
Yeah,
this is Sharon from Enrail.
yeah.
I had a couple of comments.
Oh yeah.
So great work, Arun. I mean, what you're doing. I just wanted to share my 2 cents
Yeah.
of listening to you. My 2 cents is that saying that utility businesses are losing money, you need to really back it up with some kind of peer reviewed or data driven. So when you're saying LA is at like 0.5% risk, what
Mhm.
kind of peer reviewed data do you have to back that statement up?
So this is again a call to the utilities that I want to make. So what we have done is we have looked at the possible DR adoption and what is the practical possibility of adoption. We have looked at, okay, these people might have this much area on the rooftop, right? And we can say that, okay, this is a practical possibility of adoption, and then we are calculating the risk. The data is not available from the utilities to do this kind of analysis, right? We need to. So that is what I've said in the last slide, that it is a call to the utilities to provide us with data, forecasting data, where they can forecast this could be the level of penetration. Or for example, we have a distribution of penetration level. Once we have that, we have the model. Like we have created a model which can estimate risk. Okay. Now the data that I have used here is data from all of the counties, and it is a generalized assumption that we are making that the penetration levels are going to be in a specific fashion, right? The DR size are going to increase, but to say that it might not be valid at all locations. Okay. When I talk about LA County, that is looking at very specific data that we have from the open sources, right? What we need is we need specific DR data, DR penetration data from the utilities, load data from the utilities, and look at how these things vary, and what is the penetration level that varies, and then we can estimate the risk. What we are trying to say is that we have models, and it is important to look at the risk. Okay. If the customers have behind the meter DR, say 5 kilowatts or 10 kilowatts, it is a risk to the utility business. That's what we're trying to do. We're not making a strong statement towards the utility saying that, oh, you will lose. Okay, we're saying you might lose. I should probably rephrase my argument. Oh, you might lose. Yeah.
I'll just have one sentence before I
Yeah, yeah,
keep my mouth shut. So my after listening to your talk, I'd
Mhm,
say that as with more electrification goals, in my experience of working with several utilities, most of them have revenue forecasts going up, like significant increases in revenue.
mhm.
And so that is why I would say that if you are making it part of your dissertation, try to add more,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
literature backup for
Yeah.
this. And capital investment in utilities is at odds with most of the climate goals across all state policies in all 50 states.
Mhm,
So the other way I think you can think of is how you can take this risk assessment
mhm.
and add an angle where every today, at the end of the day, all utilities live by something called rate case design, where
Yeah, okay.
every customer has to pay a certain rate. So now
Mhm,
with AMI meter, with more DERs, like can every customer have a rate case well suited to themselves? So that way it can become like a win-win for the utility and as
mhm,
well as a win-win for the customer,
mhm,
because net metering pushing for more DERs is in line with all state policies. So utilities will
mhm,
have to follow that.
mhm,
But again, I mean, I think you have great work in terms of the risk, but if you can tie the risk to some sort of a rate case design,
mhm.
utilities will be very excited about looking at the problem rather than getting scared of losing business.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. So
So
why I don't want to scare away the utilities. I just want so what our direction towards going in this in with this talk was when me and Dr. Singh discussed, we were like, it is not to like scare away the utility saying that, oh, this is a problem, but it is more towards trying to find common solutions where we can, as you said, a specific rate case designed for customer needs, right? So that is one of the things that we were in discussion with, but we were not. So for that, we need to be more collaborative with the utilities, get more data and more insights about how these utilities work with uh, uh, different kinds of scenarios. So that is one thing that we are looking at. And I also want to ask this one specific idea that we are looking at is uh, there are, as you said in your comment, there are non-wires alternative solutions where so this is one thing that I wonder, what different specific non-wire alternate solutions have been deployed? Are there any deployments that you were aware of around?
Yeah, I mean, non-wire alternatives is like a big topic in itself, and one of them can be encouraging customers to adopt more energy efficiency programs.
Mhm.
And it can also be like encouraging people to, better time of use pricing. So we can have a separate conversation, Arun. I think I should leave time for other questions,
Yeah.
but feel free to email me and I'll give you an example, several examples of how NWA is implemented across
Yeah,
utilities. I
yeah.
can talk to you more.
Yeah. Thank you, Shyam.
Hi, Noel.
Good morning.
Hey,
Ahmed,
good morning,
Ahmed,
Noel.
you go, and then we have a
Yeah,
question from
yeah,
Anurag. Go ahead, Ahmed.
no question. But so, Arun, you mentioned the laws and other things. Did you consider NEM 3.0?
I am not aware of that. Can you explain me a little more about what is MEM 3.0?
Okay, no, it's not time to explain you all
Yeah,
3.0.
yeah. Oh,
You
just
read
give me
what is
a.
3.0. Okay, consider
Mhm.
those NEM 3.0 because your example is all in California, but California right now from this month they are using 3.0. It is
Okay,
not
okay.
net metering
So,
but net metering with some real time pricing. So if you
Okay.
don't consider, then I don't know how, your results how where it will go.
Yeah,
But well,
okay.
that's different thing. Second thing is you mentioned the loss, many things, and the loss, and then what happened? Like you mentioned net metering price something 22 cents or something, and
Yeah.
retail pricing. How do you get those things?
No, we got this for as an average data from the EIA portal. So there's a Energy Information Association. So we got the average rates for each county. It's not very specific utilities, but we looked at the county data.
Okay. Yeah. Third one is you. Most of the cases you mentioned, let's say peak power or sorry peak load
Low.
for.
Yeah.
But why do you consider peak load? Because when you install any PV, there is a rule
Hmm. Hmm.
depending on not the peak load, depending on your total demand, whole year demand, and then there is a
Hmm.
rule. You cannot install. You mentioned that the average something 22 kilowatt. I don't know how to get it, but there is rule.
Hmm.
You cannot install whatever you want in your room. Maybe
Yeah.
some state may have, but that does not depend on your peak load. It mainly depend on the your whole consumption.
Hmm.
Okay,
So
so yeah,
there
those
are
things maybe you can consider.
different regulations in the US that limits the PV installation, right?
Yeah, of course. And
uh,
yeah, and finally, one thing that you mentioned loss. Can you let's say I have $100 bill. What is the loss
Mhm.
for the? Can you tell me? And if I have solar, and how do you calculate the loss?
So there are many components in the electricity bill. Okay, what we have looked at is we are only looking at the loss in terms of the energy price that the utilities might get. Okay, let us say you're considering your without DER, let us say the energy price that the customer is paying is about $100, and with DER, the energy price that the customer is paying is about $80. So the net loss is about $20. That is what I'm calculating here.
So this is not loss. I don't know how to. This is it loss? This is
I
the
mean,
loss from the utility. They are paying this $20. That is loss. I don't know. Loss means expense minus something. I don't know. That is not loss.
I mean, that is okay. Okay. Yeah.
All right. Okay. We can discuss those things. Yeah.
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 All right. Thank you.
So, Aman, if you can put a link in the chat to that reference, just to make sure Arun has it for his reference.
Mhm.
Okay, so there's a question from Anurag. What will be the best visibility approach for DER, DR, specifically changing with time to impact the reliability in real time?
Real-time analysis of DA reliability would be very difficult because the utility has to have visibility of what is happening behind the meter. If or there are some cases where the energy consumption is calculated at the meter and then looked at what is the net demand seen by the utility, and is the utility able to meet that net demand. Now, the point that we are trying to make here is that in some residential utilities where they are only focused on residential customers, if the revenues are not as much as before, it could cause an unbalance in the revenues and maintenance of the network. So if that maintenance is not done properly, there is like increased failures there. So real-time reliability is not something that we are looking at. We are only looking at the planning stage, but I'm not sure how to formulate or look at real-time reliability in the distribution system.
Anurag, did you have a follow-up? Or are you good?
Thank you. No, I'm good.
Okay. All right. Anybody else have a question? Arun?
Here from IIT Madras.
Yeah.
Arun, very good presentation, and you have put a lot of details into the studies. I just have one query on the net metering aspect. So it is basically metering on the real power, or do you also consider it unbalanced and harmonics that comes out of the DR operations? Are these included as a part of tariff, or it is simply based on the real power?
No, we right now what we're doing is we have simply based it on the real power.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Got time for maybe one more? All right. Well, I'm going to put Arun's email in the chat. So for those couple people that had some suggestions and questions, that you all can reach out to him. And thank you, Arun. We really appreciate you presenting today. Thanks everybody for your comments and suggestions. And it's really great to have our grad students be able to present and get feedback from such great professionals across many different areas and organizations, and even from India. So thanks everybody. We will not, let's see, Tiffany, do we have a webinar next month?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, so I think May will be our last webinar, and then we'll have theme meetings and workshops, and then we'll continue to have in the fall. We want to have some of our field demonstrations, some more detail on those as we wrap up UISys. So we appreciate everybody being here, and have a great day.
Thank you all for the comments, and thanks for attending the webinar.